Welcome to the Faith Seeking Understanding podcast, where we do deep dives into theology and philosophy to help Christians develop an anti-fragile faith. We are busy looking at the question of divine providence or divine sovereignty, or I guess you could say the problem which arises between God's control of everything and humans' freedom to do things for reasons and values that they have.
Yeah, that's what we've been thinking about. You said anti-fragile.
I did.
What does that mean?
We're starting with a new intro to the episodes, which is more interesting and has our tagline that currently only exists in the description of YouTube that no one looks at.
And on our website.
And on our website, yeah. What does anti-fragile mean? It's a term I got from Nassim Taleb, who wrote a book by the same name. And basically it means that an anti-fragile system is one that grows as a result of stress or in response to stress. So it's contrasted with like a brittle system, which when it's put under stress or pressure will break, and a resilient system which doesn't have any, it resists all change, outside change, for the better or for the worse. So it doesn't grow from it, and if you get over its threshold at some point, it will just break, right? Where anti-fragile is more like it gets put under pressure, it gets a little bit damaged, but then repairs itself and grows stronger as a result of that stress. Yeah. So you can think of any living organism as anti-fragile.
And so an anti-fragile faith then, that would be faith that can adapt to being interrogated.
Yeah,
and
or challenged.
Strengthened even from being interrogated and challenged. And
yeah, an anti-fragile faith has a healthy response to challenge, outside challenge, whether that be a moral challenge like suffering or something like that, or an intellectual challenge like something that would make you doubt or something like that. In either case, you take that on and respond to it in a healthy way, and at the end of your grappling with it, you are better for it. You're stronger, you're more mature, you're wiser, you're whatever.
Yeah.
You can contrast that with maybe what a brittle faith would be, which is, you come across the first stumbling block or first anything, and that just causes you to spiral into doubt and uncertainty and eventually leave the faith. And then a resilient faith, which sounds like a good thing,
yeah,
it's kept resilient by virtue of not engaging with those outside things. So it's like shutting them out. And so it's kind of I want to say a naive faith in the same way that a brittle faith is. It's only preserved by virtue of how much it can ignore of the challenges that comes up against it.
Yeah. Sort of gets through by just kind of pulling a fist and powering on.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Avoiding any challenges that might come by, either through like groupthink or, whatever. Most people, I would say most caricatures of faith treat it like a resilient thing. And unfortunately, many people's faith is resilient because they haven't been given the tools to helpfully engage with challenges or difficulties.
Yeah, I mean, so challenges actually become an opportunity to strengthen your faith rather than a threat to it, which just seems like a much healthier place to be.
Yeah.
So we've been trying to navigate one of those challenges. Like you mentioned a moment ago, we've got the biblical author's perspective, which is all the way through, not just from one or two places, all the way through there's this perspective that God is absolutely in control. And on the other hand, all the way through there's this perspective that humans are making real decisions, that there genuinely does seem to be the sense of free will. We have moral responsibility, which wouldn't really work without free will. We're often given reasons why this or that character made the decisions that they did. So we've got this tension here. Actually, we see it quite strongly in the book of Proverbs. We looked at a few where they actually just put right next to each other. A person's heart plans their way, but the Lord establishes their steps. But there's this tension there, and we are thinking about, okay, how do we navigate that?
Yeah, and so far we've done 2 episodes in this, right? The first episode was just talking about our experiences of this. In our context, I guess they just happened not to be particularly anti-fragile in the way that we were taught or engaged with it, which is unfortunate. We're trying to remedy that.
Yeah.
Second episode, we looked at passages in the Bible that kind of hold up both of these and saw that it's not just one or two proof texts, but it's the consistent witness across the whole biblical body of work.
Yeah, the biblical authors weren't like obsessed with this tension. In fact, they didn't really seem to care too much for the tension. They were just, but it's just abundantly clear from start to finish that both of these things are true.
Yeah. And unfortunately, because they weren't interested in it as a theological question to be grappled with,
They didn't explain it to us either.
they didn't explain it to us either. Exactly. So what we have then is a bunch, and we discussed this a bit in the first episode, where we have a bunch of very important data points that we have to fill out if we want to get a complete picture to help us think through all of this. But the data points aren't sufficient to fully fix one option or another. And so now we're left with, okay, we got to look at different models for how we could fill this in. We're going to look at the one that we like the most over the next few episodes.
Yeah.
And then in the few episodes that follow, we'll contrast that with some of the other models that are kind of similarly developed and see how we can then compare these outside of the dots that we need to connect, and sometimes inside the dots as well, maybe. Yeah.
So to join those dots, one of the things that we were talking about was the fact that the biblical data, the passages that we come across that talk about one or the other, we need to be able to join those dots in a way that actually all of them are joined, that all of them kind of come together to make a picture. But the way that we join those dots often will depend on us kind of, because the biblical authors didn't answer this question for us, to go outside of that, and that often means a foray into other disciplines, most often philosophy.
Yeah, and that makes sense just by virtue of the fact that philosophy deals with very general categories like metaphysics, and those are the sorts of categories you need in order to talk about God and creatures from the same point of view, right? Because it's general enough categories to capture both of those. It's not always. Sometimes we could go to like science or biology or something like that, sociology. But at least in this case, we're squarely with our feet in metaphysics to figure this out.
Yeah, it's sort of the very building blocks of reality that we need to come to grips with. So yeah, over the next couple of episodes, we need to start looking at what some of those building blocks are, and what are some of the categories and some of the ideas that we need to join those dots well.
Right.
So what are we going to be looking at first?
We're going to be looking at, so the view that we're articulating is something I've called Omni-instrumentality. I gave it that name, but I didn't come up with the view. The view is not mine. It is, it's basically a synthesis of mostly the work by Bernard Lonergan, who on the shelf here is number 1. I mean, he's 1 to 4 there, but it's the book number 1 that discusses it, where he's discussing, I think it's Grace and Freedom, which is actually 2 books in one. It's his original PhD thesis, and then a follow-up book version of it that he wrote like a decade later or something, that summarizes the same stuff but in a different format. And then so that he's the, like, what could you say, like the majority stakeholder in the view.
Right.
But then there's another guy, Lonergan-McArthur, who wrote a very important paper. I'm going to have to look up the name. It's like Universal in Precando and Universal in Actando or something like that. I can't remember
Some fancy
exactly.
Latin name.
Yeah. Which I think kind of fills in a gap that Lonergan just didn't need to discuss in his articulation, but it was very helpful for a full articulation. So you could equally call it like the Lonergan-McArthur model.
Okay.
But I like to call it Omni-instrumentality. We'll see why.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool naming it after them, like give them their credit, but actually going for a more descriptive title seems to make more sense to me.
It also it kind of captures the, when you say it's the Lonergan-McArthur model, it kind of suggests that it arose with these two people. But actually both Lonergan and MacArthur in their respective works that we would be citing were claiming that what they're saying is the correct interpretation of Aquinas. So it's actually a very Thomistic model.
Yeah.
And it's different to what is typically goes by the name Thomistic model, which is Benesianism, which we'll get to in a later episode when we contrast all these different views with each other. So it's sort of, calling it omni-instrumentality kind of lifts it from any sort of historical assumptions about where it arose and focuses just on like what the model's actually trying to propose. So maybe we could start with like the basic premise of the model. Should I write this down? No, I don't need to write this down. I'll put some cool summary slides in or something. The central idea of it is built around this notion of concurrence, which is something, it's a feature, it features in pretty much every single model of divine sovereignty, divine providence. But it has a particular account of concurrence. But let me maybe just say intuitively what concurrence is for a second.
Yeah.
Concurrence is the cooperation between God and secondary causes in bringing about their effects.
Yeah, okay. A lot of that's going to need spelling out.
Yeah. So there's God, right? Okay, we all know who God is.
Okay.
Secondary cause. So God is the primary cause. He's the first cause, right? He's the thing that all other things in existence depend on to live, to act. In Him we live and move and have our being, as Paul says in the Areopagus. So then, because He's the primary cause or the first cause, then we want to say, well, they really are agents in creation, like creatures that do things, like really do things, like they bring about effects. And so we call them secondary causes in relation to Him as the primary cause. Okay. This is contrasted with a view that we're not going to consider because it isn't biblical, but it's called occasionalism, which basically says that they aren't really secondary causes. That anything that looks like a creature doing something is actually just an illusion, and God is really the only one doing anything.
Sure.
Okay. So the way the name comes from is that the agent, the fire being near the metal is the occasion for God to heat the metal. But it's not that the fire is actually doing anything, right? Whereas concurrence is saying, no. They are secondary causes, and they really do bring about effects. However, they do so by virtue of cooperation with the first cause, which is God.
Right.
Okay. So that's the kind of middle ground between occasionalism on the one hand and just mere conservation on the other hand, which is God does not work with secondary causes. He just holds them in existence, and they just do everything independently.
Right.
The concurrence is the middle ground there. Okay. So all of the views that we would consider, and I think all of the views that we listed in one of the episodes prior to this, they are built around a theory of concurrence. They just differ on what concurrence is, and therefore like how much they can get out of it in their respective theory, right? Sometimes they need to add additional stuff on top of that to fully explain how God can control things. Our view, like most Thomistic views, or our view, omni-instrumentality, like most Thomistic views, is like, no, we have a very strong view of concurrence, a very rich view that we can then draw out, but we basically just draw out implications and work with it as it is without having to add new stuff on.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the common thing. Now, omni-instrumentality's account of concurrence, we're going to get some more fancy words now. According to omni-instrumentality, concurrence is God's essential cooperation with nature.
Okay.
So in order to account for that, we need to explain what essential cooperation is. Like, what is that word essential doing there?
Yeah.
Also, what is cooperation?
Yeah.
And then we also have to explain what nature is. Like, what are the other options that could have been there instead of nature that we're saying that.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't explain why the name is called omni-instrumentality. So if I said it slightly differently, I said an equivalent statement, you would get it, right? So an equivalent way of saying that is our natures are God's instruments.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so there we go. So all of nature, you could say, is God's instrument, but each thing's individual nature is God's instrument. And that's where the notion of instrumentality comes from.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Although what does it mean to be an instrument?
Yeah.
Well, an instrument is that which an agent essentially cooperates with. Right, so we're kind of getting back to that notion of essential cooperation.
I mean, instrument comes with connotations of being used, which I don't think
Yes.
I think rubs people up the wrong way.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's there in Isaiah.
Yep.
Assyria is an axe in God's hand,
100%.
but it's still, I think, especially without spelling it out, it can still feel a bit icky.
Yep. And I think that's an important thing we need to come back to. Like, we need to put a pin in that intuition, because by the end of this, we want to have explained why that intuition works in the case of our instruments, but doesn't work in the case of God's instruments.
Yeah.
Because it's a faint intuition. Like, it's a thing that needs to be accounted for.
Yeah.
We're not going to get to it in this episode.
No.
We might get to it in the next episode. Definitely within the next 3 episodes, we will explain that. We just need enough formal machinery, if you will, to get to the point where we can explain what that difference is.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So with all of those definitions and categories and everything articulated with no actual details, we can start getting into details. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just gonna the omni bit of Omni-instrumentality is just all the allness of it.
Yeah, all of nature.
It's another Latin term that we're used to, that God is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. So I think like we're used to seeing omni there, but it's worth just, that is a Latin term. Let's just throw it out there. It means all.
Yeah.
So everything instrumentality.
Yeah. And actually, we kind of would need to explain that when we get to nature, because I said, it's essential cooperation with nature, not its alternatives. So then why are we saying omni?
Yeah.
We can't explain that. So both parts of the name, I didn't realize this when I came up with the name. Both parts of the name are like questions that, when answered, you understand what the proposal is.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Nice.
Thanks for articulating that. Thanks for pointing that out. It's actually I took it from it's a variation of a view articulated by Paul Helseth, which is omni-causality.
Okay.
Which is too general, and it's not what we're going for. That's a compatibilistic model. We're not doing that. We're not going a compatibilist. Well, we're not.
I mean, we sort of are to,
we're
in
articulating
a sense, but
compatibility with libertarian freedom, not a compatibilistic freedom.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I mean,
I think we mentioned this in the first episode that compatibilism is a very unhelpful word because everyone thinks something is compatible with something else.
Yeah. No. Exactly.
So we'll get to that.
And even with the same people, like you've got interpreters of Aquinas on both sides saying he's a compatibilist, he's not a compatibilist,
yeah.
And so much of it comes down to the baggage that we attach to this or that word.
Yeah. So that's something we're going to get to, not in this episode either, in the next episode, when we're kind of delving more into nature, into the details of nature. We're going to look at nature at a high level today, and then delve into some of the details like freedom and all that other kind of stuff in the next episode.
Yeah. All right. So the specific things that we're dealing with in this episode are
cooperation, the three modes of cooperation, and then nature and its alternatives.
Cool.
Okay. So, what is cooperation? What does it mean to cooperate?
Intuitively, it just means to kind of work together with somebody, I think.
Right. Yeah. So two things cooperate when they work together in some way to bring about some effect or some product. Okay. We can focus on just two because mathematically, you could generalize. If you can explain how two things cooperate, you can generalize that to any finite number.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm going to believe you on that one and leave it at that.
This is a common thing actually in maths to prove something about binary operations, but it doesn't matter.
Cool.
As long as you can show that something is pairwise the case, then you can show.
I'm a twice over humanities student. That's a little bit above my pay grade.
Yeah, I'm a math student moonlighting in humanities. Okay, so Lonergan gives us a threefold division of cooperation. He says there's three different kinds of cooperation. He doesn't explain why they're exhaustive. We can explain why they're exhaustive. So these are all the different ways that two things can cooperate. I'm going to go through them first, and then we can just briefly gesture to why they're exhaustive. Okay, so the first kind of cooperation is called coordinate cooperation, as in like the coordinates on a map. Or more like coordination is actually what it's talking about. So two things can be coordinated in their production. This happens when you have two causes and they work together independently of one another to produce a singular effect.
Right.
Okay, so, well, actually, maybe let's test you. So when I say that, what kind of examples come to mind?
Building different things on a car. The production line on a car. You got.
That's a good one.
You've got. And in fact, that was one of the big things that sped up the automobile industry, if I'm not mistaken. The fact that you had some genius who's like, well, if somebody's actually just focusing on making these parts, and somebody else is focusing on just these parts, and then it sort of comes together, then we've got a much more efficient process than one person who's just doing everything.
Yeah, that's actually a really good example, and it shows you. Because they're both, that kind of shows you why they're independent of each other, right? Like, like, yeah, the one needs to put something in the final product before the other one does, and so in that sense they're dependent. But like the second person's acting is not dependent upon the first person being it. Like the first person could go out of existence after they do their job, and the second person could still produce their thing and the effect. That's what makes it so easy to automate, because now we've like delineated all the different coordinate causes, and now we can work on automating each one independently, without having to like get a human to work with it or something like that. That's a very complicated version of what I usually think of, but
what do you usually think?
Two people picking up a box. Or when we move this table every time, right? Like I can't move the table by myself without scratching the floor, but you and I can combine our pulling or pushing or lifting actions to move the table. But I don't make you pull. I don't give you the ability to pull. You don't give me the ability to pull. We're just kind of working together.
Pulling together,
Even, and this is something where I think we have to get on the same page with regards to what we mean by cooperation. Even two people playing a game of tug of war, producing the tension in the rope, is cooperation in our respective in our sense, in our metaphysical sense. In terms of like their wills or their desires, it's competition. Right? Because they're trying to do opposite things. But they're cooperating in the sense of working together, combining their causality to produce an effect. That's sort of what's going on there.
Right.
So we should keep that in mind. When we talk about cooperation, we don't always necessarily mean that the respective causes like agree with one another or something like that. Okay, so that is coordinate cooperation. The next one we could call accidental cooperation, which is going to confuse some people who aren't familiar with scholastic jargon, because we're not actually talking about an accident like a car accident. We're just meaning accidental in... How would you describe accidental?
Its existence is owing to some other more fundamental thing.
Oh, that's too metaphysical.
That's too high level.
Yeah, too high level.
I remember in this translation of Aristotle, instead of accidental, which is what I was expecting to find, he uses coincidental.
Oh, coincidental. Okay, yeah.
Which is I find interesting, and because I was still a very new Aristotelian, found myself thrown for a little bit of a loop. But
that's actually So what we mean by accidental is like not essential, which again is a word that we have to define.
We were still going to come to that one.
So that's why I was kind of struggling there for a second. But coincidental is a pretty good thing. It's like these things don't have to be together. They just happen to coincide. So the accidents, you could often translate that as like, it just happened to be the case. And that it just happened to be is kind of getting at the accidents.
Which is, I guess, how down the line we ended up with our accident.
So some examples of accidents in the scholastic sense, it would be like your height or your eye color or your hair length or something. Like these things can change without you going out of existence because they coincide with you and maybe they depend on you, but they aren't like intrinsic to who you are.
So there's a fundamental Rolandness that actually, if you were to dye your hair, that doesn't take away from that, doesn't change that. It just alters the appearance.
I thought you were going to say if I were to die. And I was like, that's going to be a bad example because if I die, I go to resistance. But if I were to dye my hair, or change my clothes or anything like that. So this, how would we depict this? Well, we can depict this simply by saying one thing causes another, and then that thing causes the next thing. Okay. So this is maybe won't be entirely clear until we get to the third one of how we do it, but in a sense, this we see now an ordering between the two elements, between the two causes. So let me label these. The first cause we'll call A, the second cause we'll call B, and then we'll call the effect C. Okay.
I mean, on one level, that's actually more intuitive than the first one. That, or perhaps could also be used with the construction of a car. That you've got somebody does the one bit, it gets passed on, and somebody does the next bit, and then somebody does the next bit.
That's why I said your example was complicated, because it actually it involves multiple cooperations depending on how you carve up the effects and the causes. And that's fine. Most things in reality involve multiple versions of cooperation. I want to say cooperating, coinciding with one another, which is...
we can't get away from our words.
The key thing here is, so B depends on A in some sense. So B is passive with respect to A, and A is active. But then B has some of its own actuality, or its own activeness, that it can combine what A did to it together with what it has in itself to produce C. Okay.
Sounds like a game past the parcel.
It is kind of like past the parcel. So when B is causing C, A need not exist. But B uses whatever A produced in B in its causation of C. Okay, so there's some independence and some dependence between the two causes.
Divine providence in party games.
Divine providence. So
that's sort of the road that we're on at the moment.
The classical example of accidental cooperation is of like generations begetting each other. So a father begetting a son and a son begetting a grandson. Like the father needs to beget the son in order for the son to exist and do anything. But the father can go out of existence and not be around, hopefully won't be around, when the son begets the grandson. I mean, hopefully won't. It doesn't have to help with the son begetting the grandson. I mean, hopefully they'll be around in the sense that they can be a grandparent. But but you can see there's like a dependence of the son on the father, but not an entire or intrinsic dependence. Like there's still some independence that the son has to act on his own. That example is good. It kind of gives the impression that all accidental cooperation is across time, which is not the case. Accidental cooperation can be simultaneous as well. So think of one person lifting up another person so that other person can reach something on a higher shelf. Right? So that's simultaneous, right? If the first person lets go, the second person's going to fall. But the second person has some dependence on the first person to be at a certain height above the ground. But the second person's ability to reach is something that they have independently of the first person, right? They could do that regardless. Just maybe they couldn't reach high enough, right? And so there's independence and dependence there that's going on,
right?
So both of these actually have. So your example of coordinate cooperation was across time. My example was simultaneous, and then we have two examples of accidental cooperation: one across time, one simultaneous. Okay. So the last, we haven't gotten to the one that is important, the one that we want to talk about. So the last one is essential cooperation. Lonergan does not call it essential cooperation. He calls it serial cooperation, but I find that an extremely unhelpful name because in some sense, accidental cooperation is serial as well.
Serial as in belonging to a series.
As belonging to a series, yes. Sorry, not as in the thing you eat in the morning. Yes. He was not making a point about frosted flakes. He was making a point about cooperation.
Metaphysics of eating breakfast.
So I prefer the term essential just because it is often the thing that's contrasted with accidental in scholastic philosophy. It is also, for example, accidental cooperation is what occurs between members in an accidentally ordered causal series. And essential cooperation is what obtains between members of an essentially ordered causal series. We're not going to go into that.
Right.
But that's a distinction that's very common in scholastic thought, often for arguments for God's existence. And we're talking about the same thing here. These aren't just like verbal agreements. Like they really are the same thing that's going on. Okay, so what happens in essential cooperation? Well, in some sense, it's similar to accidental cooperation in the sense that you have an ordering between the elements. However, the first causation also causes the second causation. Okay, so it's a caused causing. Okay, so we could draw this in a slightly different way to articulate this a bit differently. So we could say that if we consider B acting on C, I shouldn't have drawn it like that. We consider B acting on C, we can say, well, B doesn't have any actuality in itself to cause C, any independence of itself to cause C. It has the potential, it has the capacity to cause C, but it can't bring itself to do that. Okay, so maybe we draw that with like a broken line to indicate that there is something there. There's something about B that could cause C if it's activated, but B can't bring itself to activate that thing. Okay, and so what we need then is A to come along and not only cause something in B that causes C, but actually cause that causation. Right? That might be a more helpful way to articulate what's going on.
Right, yeah.
Any examples of that you can think of?
Aristotle's famous one was of pushing a rock with a stick.
Yeah. That's a really good one. So the one I like to use is more specific, and I can explain why in a second, but if you consider drawing a figure 8 on the ground with a stick, Okay, so it's the same, basically the same idea, or moving a rock. You could say moving a rock in a shape, in a pattern of some kind. Similarly, you could say using a piece of chalk to write on a blackboard. Can't think of any other examples that are like, hey?
Painting a picture.
Painting a picture, yeah. Anything like that. Notice that all of these things are instruments that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So that kind of is doing
gesturing
justice.
in the direction
yeah
we're heading down.
Now, I make this distinction because there is a sense in which sticks and chalk and paintbrushes can move by themselves, right? So Newton tells us that if you let things will move in a straight line if not acted on by outside forces. So inertia, right? Which Aristotle did not know about. He believed in something like it, but not quite what ended up being as general as Newton's inertia. And that there's a guy called Thomas McLaughlin. We don't have to know too much about this, but he argues that like that is actually a product of the agent itself, of the thing itself. So B in this case. So the stick, in a sense, its form moves it in a straight line. It doesn't, not by force, not using a force, but using formal causation. Okay, right? So that is something that it can do. But it can't move itself in a non-rectilinear motion, right? In a non-straight line, like a figure eight, or like the writing on a board, or the complex brush strokes that you do in a painting. Gotcha. It has the potential to move in all those ways because it could be pushed every which way and start moving in a straight line in those ways, right? Yeah. But it can't bring itself to move in those ways, and so that's why I like to focus on particularly the shape that's being drawn. Yeah. And this helps explain something, because if I'm moving a piece of chalk really quickly and writing on a board, right, and then it breaks, the chalk goes flying. And so someone might say, well, how is that acting without you causing it to act? And it's like, well, it's moving in a straight line. Yeah. If you take away like gravitational effects, which are just other outside causes that could be happening. Yeah. But it stops moving in the shape of writing immediately upon it breaking. Yeah. Right? Because now I'm no longer able to, me as an agent, I'm no longer able to actualize its moving in that shape. Yeah. So that helps us explain that thing, which has puzzled people in the past when I've explained this to them. So I thought we could just explain that briefly. Yeah, absolutely. So essential cooperation happens when this middle agent has the potential to act in a particular way, but not the actuality to bring itself to act in that way. Whereas accidental cooperation, there is some actuality in the middle agent that is able to bring about the thing, but maybe they need some kind of precondition met by an earlier agent. Or now I'm saying the middle person, but we could say secondary cause here. Okay, so the A would be the first cause, B would be the second cause, and C would be the effect. Okay. Yeah. Now we see why we call them first and second, because we have an ordering given by causation. Yeah. Okay. Does this make sense? Do we want to go into...
Does this make sense?
Does this make sense? Yeah. Leave a like in the comments. Like and subscribe. No, wait, that's later. Leave a comment if you
got questions.
Yeah, if we need to answer more questions about this, happy to do that.
If we get enough of them, we'll do a separate Q&A video.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'll sort of get woven in if they come in time.
Yeah, exactly. I do have a series of blog posts where I articulate my first articulation of Omni-instrumentality, and that'll be posted in the links as well if people are not afraid of reading. Very long blog posts. I guess there's different ways that we could show why these are exhaustive. Like a corporation has to be one of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but like a really basic one is you could just kind of you could say this. Okay, two things are working to cause one thing. Okay, two things are working to cause an effect. That's what cooperation is. Okay, either those things are independent of each other or they're not. Okay. Right? That's just like yes or no. Okay. If they're independent of each other, we have coordinate cooperation. If they're not, like one is dependent upon the other, then we have either accidental cooperation or essential cooperation. Okay. Right. Now, given that one is dependent on the other, it's either partially dependent or entirely dependent. Yeah. If it's partially dependent, it's accidental cooperation, and if it's entirely dependent, it's essential cooperation. And so because at each stage now, we've just divided into X or not X, we know that we're covering the whole field, and we could further divide them. Like we've already kind of looked at further divisions of simultaneity and non-simultaneity. But the point is that these three that Lonergan has articulated are in fact exhaustive. even if at a high level. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a very simple way of articulating. There are other ways of showing that, but I think that's the basic gist of them.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have anything else we need to say about that? Go for it. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, so whatever guards control over, this is where we're getting too long term, but whatever guards control over human freedom amounts to, it's one of these options.
It's got to be
in
one
some
of these.
way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Every model of concurrence has to be articulatable in terms of one of these three things, because concurrence just is cooperation, and these just are the three ways you can cooperate. Maybe it's a combination of these, because the model of concurrence is a bit muddled or confused, but like it's one of these three, and we'll see this actually in each of the three that we look at later. They basically correspond to like one or more of these in combination.
So these models are actually effectively putting around the logical boundaries. Around whatever we're going to be articulating.
Yeah, it's
or whatever anybody else is articulated to.
It's often really helpful when looking at a philosophical thing to have a complete list of things, a complete list of options. Because then you can do inductive arguments where you say like, okay, well, we said this is happening. It's going to be one of these n things. And then you just go through them and be like, well, it can't be this, it can't be this, it must be this, therefore. But what you often need when you do that is an argument that the n things that you're going through are all the options. Because because someone could just say, oh, well, what if it's some other option you haven't considered? And so that's why having these deductions of like exhaustive lists is very useful for philosophy. Yeah.
All right, so that's cooperation.
That's cooperation. Nature is going to be much easier to explain.
I'm glad.
Yeah. We don't need to meld our brain too much with nature. Plenty of nice examples, and it's not as abstract.
Right.
Basically, there's three options when it comes to nature. You got nature. You've got artifact, which is a word we often use, and we're going to basically be using that in the way that we use it normally. Like we talk about, like we found artifacts of an ancient civilization. Right. That's what we're talking about here. There's no other weird meaning for this. And then there's aggregate. Aggregate. Okay. So, I actually did this in the wrong way, but whatever. That's fine. So when we have nature, Aristotle says nature is the intrinsic principle of stability and change of a thing. Okay, which means that things, they change, they stay the same, they change in various ways, they stay the same in various ways. Okay, does that happen because of they themselves, or does it happen from something outside, or does it happen because of their parts entirely? That's it. Those are the three options.
Right.
Okay.
And is that aggregate, nature, artifact?
Exactly. Yeah.
Got you.
So aggregate is we talk about the thing as a whole, but it really doesn't exist over and above the sum of its parts. It's an aggregate of its parts. Okay. So we could say, we'll just say like parts. Okay. Everything is reducible to something of its parts. Think of a pile of rocks. That's an aggregate, right? Like that pile can sometimes do things that individual rocks can't do, like in the sense of like it can hold something up higher because it's piled higher, right? But really that holding up is just the sum of what those rocks are going to do if they were separate. A watch is an aggregate. A computer is an aggregate. Those are more complicated aggregates. But really, if you think about, actually, a watch isn't. Actually, those are both really bad examples of aggregates. We'll explain why in a second.
All right.
So what are other kinds of aggregates? A pile of rocks really is the main thing. A pile or a heap. Anything you would call a pile or a heap. Yeah. That is a good sense of an aggregate. An artifact has something from the outside giving it its powers or its abilities or whatever. So usually what it is an artifact is an aggregate that we have imbued meaning into from the outside with our collective agreement on what things mean. Yeah. Okay. So this is an example of a watch. Right? Yeah. Like there's nothing in the pieces of metal that make up my watch that intrinsically tells the time. Right? So if I'm considering it with respect to its ability to tell the time, that's an artifact. If I'm considering it just in terms of its ability for pieces to move in a consistent way, that's an aggregate.
Gotcha.
Right? You got cogs moving other cogs, or in my case, electrical circuits moving other, channeling electricity according to logic gates and all that kind of stuff. Moving metal that's conducting it and so on. Fine. Yeah. That's just what metal does. That's just what these things do. That's an aggregate.
So it's sort of to the degree that it's actually performing a unified action.
Exactly.
That and yeah, we'll sort of nuance that in a moment with when we talk about nature. But an aggregate and an artifact could be made of the same. It could be the same thing that we're looking at. It's just that one has been assigned a unified meaning that actually is performing a function, whereas the other is actually just being looked at together as a collection.
Yes, exactly. And that you can kind of see that in an example of a chair, right? A chair is an artifact, right? Because a chair, what's a chair? What is a chair? A chair is something you sit on.
Yeah.
So we're talking about something with respect to how we use it, to the function that we've given it, right? This table could be a chair if I sat on it, right?
Yeah.
A rock, if I found a rock randomly in the wilderness, that's a chair if I sit on it, if I want to use it as a chair, right? Whereas like as an aggregate, I could consider this table just as like a collection of metal and wood organized together.
Yeah.
So coming back to the example of an artifact is something we find about an ancient civilization. We call things artifacts, like we find there, precisely because it looks like it has a particular it had a particular function in their culture, in their society.
Yeah.
And so we're inferring what those functions would be, and in virtue of that, calling it an artifact.
Yeah.
Right. If we just found like wood and stone, but not organized together in a way that looks like an axe,
we keep digging.
it's just a wood and a stone. Yeah. It's like it is what it is. So that's the basic idea there.
Yeah.
So what's left for a nature? A nature is, we often say in itself, or we use the word Aristotle uses the word in. That's not how you spell intrinsic. Intrinsic. So this is to say, a nature of a material thing has parts, okay, but it has powers over and above the sum of those parts.
Right.
It's got powers of its own that aren't just the powers of its parts, but those powers aren't given to it from the outside. Right, so it's neither deriving all of its powers entirely. I mean, partly all of its powers are derived from its parts, right? But they're organized in a way that's beyond what its parts can do by themselves.
Yeah.
But it's also not reliant upon something else from the outside, like our cognition, giving it a meaning or a purpose.
Yeah, I think. Well, let's give some examples first, and we can spell it out a little bit more that way.
Any living thing is a great example. That's like, for Aristotle, a paradigm example of a nature, or what we sometimes call a substance. Because if you think about it, like, just think about a living human being. Imagine I die, like now, like I'm struck dead, or I just die from a weird heart attack or something, right? And you consider myself 5 seconds before I died and 5 seconds after I died, okay? I have the same material constitution, it's the same structure, it's the same everything.
Yeah.
But in the one case, I'm moving around and talking and everything. And in the other case, if you leave me alone long enough, I'll just decay into nothing, right? What is going on there, right? Yeah. It can't be the parts themselves.
Yeah.
It must be the organization of those parts that is giving each of them sort of, they're kind of self-sustaining, or they're creating this homeostasis or something like that, right? They're fighting against the entropy of the outside world to create this like living organism that is me.
Right. So a cat is a cat, regardless of what we think of it.
Exactly.
I mean, we've assigned it the name cat, but I mean,
yeah,
it is what it is, regardless of what we call it, and it'll be what it is, regardless of whether we're looking at it and making our judgments about it.
Yeah.
Whereas, a knife is not really anything, unless you've got humans or you've got some agent assigning it that role and value.
Exactly. Yeah. So you could say, in some sense, not in every sense, but in some sense, if all humans went out of existence or all animals went out of existence, all knives would go out of existence as well. Of course, you could talk about them as knives in the sense that like a human could use them in this particular way. But like, let's put that to one side. Like, let's just talk about what humans actually are doing.
Yeah.
Knives would go out of existence, but cats wouldn't, or plants wouldn't, or trees or whatever, because the one depends on the cultural conventions and stuff that exist, and if those cultures go away, so does the existence of the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's got a real existence like an aggregate, but like an artifact, it's got an existence over and above the parts. And so it's this sort of middle ground between the two. Okay. So that's I think that's where we're going to end it. But what we're saying is, we haven't put these pieces together, which is what we're going to do in the next episode.
Yeah.
But we're saying,
these pieces are going to be important.
These are the pieces that we're putting together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Concurrence is God's essential cooperation with nature.
So we're going to see which of the three cooperation models, or what combination, which of the three cooperation models is going to fit with nature, and how that then might look different if we were talking about an aggregate versus an artifact as one of nature's alternatives.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, that was a lot to get through.
Yeah.
How long has this been going on? Have you got the time there?
Probably somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes.
Okay, I was so proud of us last time for getting it down in like 20 minutes. But whatever. This is the complicated episode, so it is what it is.
Laying down the groundwork.
Cool. So thanks for joining us in this episode. Please join us next time as we continue down this journey of articulating omni-instrumentality. If you like the podcast and want to support us, then a like and subscribe on YouTube, a rating on podcast platforms. Okay, cool. You can also like our Facebook page or follow us on Twitter, or sorry, it's Twitter. It's Twitter. Otherwise, thanks for joining. We'll see you in the next one.